Okay, so this, I need to check the title for this. This is the Minnesota HPC Online Training Program session. And you may have noticed that in the program, there's only one other concurrent session besides this. That was by design, because I wanted to try to make sure that as many commission members and staff and other interested individuals would be able to attend this, and we wouldn't be in competition with a couple of other concurrent events. So thanks all of you for coming. Successful local preservation programs can only be accomplished where committed and knowledgeable preservationists like you guys participate in local government. And I think all of you, if you're a commission member or a staff or an elected official who represents a community that's interested in preservation like Mayor Hicks, you all know that HPCs are on the front lines every single day. You're at the center of preservation action every single day, making tough decisions. And I think you would also agree that continuing education is one of the pillars of a strong HPC. And that's a tall order to achieve, to educate commission members on a regular basis. So the question is, how do we provide the education to you folks on an annual, on a monthly, on a weekly, daily basis? Well, to help answer that question, I'm going to turn it over to Abby Whitman from the City of Stillwater. She's the city planner and the staff to the Stillwater HPC.
Thanks, Mike. As Mike said, and it was kind of one of the things that really brought me to what we have as our partnership today, is HPCs are in need of kind of that base work foundation, training and education, so that they're able to do what they're charged to do. I came on with the City of Stillwater about 4 years ago, and my first day as staff, we had an HPC meeting in which we had 2 vacancies from 2 long-term members who had just left. They've been with the commission for decades. So we were sitting with a low HPC, new members were starting to come on, we had a little bit of turnover, and the question I kept going to Mike with was, how do I train them? Where do I send them? What information does the state have? And Mike kept saying, well, we have a camp training scheduled next spring. And the camp trainings are wonderful, but it really wasn't enough for that consistent ongoing training or when you have a new commissioner come in. I have a new commissioner in the audience today. She's been with us for 2 months. There hasn't been a camp for a little while to be able to send her to. So we started, Mike and I started talking about what we might be able to do, who I might be able to partner with to develop some sort of training program, and he led me to Courtney Kramlinger with the City of Mankato and Lori Creamer with the City of Eden Prairie, who both had a very similar need. What we need to be able to educate our commissioners, but also too the people that are working with our commissions, our counselors, our attorneys, other staff members, building officials. So we designed a grant to submit to MNHS for the partnership program. I think tomorrow morning there is a session on the partnership grant, and if you're not familiar with it, I really strongly advise you all to take a look at it, because I think it's a really great opportunity moving forward for all organizations in the state of Minnesota to develop programs, to develop partnerships with other agencies, other interested individuals, to kind of create some long-term lasting effects within Minnesota. We were awarded a grant, and part of our grant was to develop an online training program, and we didn't really know what that was. The things that we knew for sure is that we wanted to have something that I could take to my commission, and if we only had 20 minutes, 30 minutes at the end of the meeting, we could go through a small module of legal issues. If there seemed to be some challenges as to what we were really supposed to be doing, we could talk about the role of the commission. But to have these short subsets that could be taken individually or we wanted to spend 4 hours one day, we could do the whole kit and caboodle, but something that really had this broad range of items for the commission to really have a better understanding of the training that they may need. We also really wanted to have our training program designed for you, for commissioners, but like I said, our counselors, our elected officials, our attorneys, who aren't on the front lines, but sometimes get thrown into the front lines with appeals, with political decisions, with all the sorts of politics that occur that brings them into the preservation arena when they're just not there every day. We went through a full procurement process where we had 7 proposals, 7 very highly qualified proposals to develop this program. And with those, it was like comparing apples and kumquats. It was not even anywhere close. We had a company out of Maryland, we had a company out of California who wanted a lot of bells and whistles, and we really wanted bells and whistles, but really we needed to break this down into content. This is really kind of what we looked at as the potential of a first phase of our partnership and developing very strong content so that all of our commissioners, all of our preservationists across the state had the same kind of information, that we're looking at the same kind of training program, and that somebody in East Grand Forks had the same information as somebody in Egan. You know, it really was a matter of trying to get everybody on the same page. So that's how we found Winter and Company out of Boulder, Colorado, and on their tagline of their proposal, it said, Winter and Company loves training programs, and it really came to be that they did. And through Nori's work with the NEPC in the 1990s, he worked with many different states with statewide training. He was kind of instrumental in helping develop what is some of the foundations of the CAMP program today. But some of the things that really caught our eye with the Winter and Company proposal was partners, advisors, and the transferability of the program. In addition to the 3 partner communities, Nori recommended that we do some outreach with not only research communities, but also advisor communities. So we had, I believe, 22 research communities that are in this room that we looked online. We looked at what you had, we looked at the training programs, we looked at your HPC education, and we stole it. And then we went and we talked with 4 to 6 other advisor communities, little communities, big communities. We really wanted to make sure we had the rural communities addressed and the metropolitan communities addressed. And talked about what their needs were, what the training issues were, where there were gaps. So with that, we decided that we would enter into contact with Winter and Company, and big reasons additionally with what he was proposing, what they were proposing is their company has a very diversified preservation planning services. They've worked on revitalization, design guidelines, adaptive reuse. Most notably, they've developed programs exactly like this, most recently with the state of Maryland. Nori served as the NEPC chair between 1992 and 1996, and that was his time period when he worked quite a bit on those, what now are CAMP trainings. He's the president of Winter and Company out of Boulder, Colorado, which is a planning, urban design, and heritage preservation services organization. As a national consultant, they worked with 40 different states, or in 40 different states throughout many of the years. He's been a speaker at many National Trust, National Park Service, and American Planning Association conferences. Most notably, he was the 2013 keynote speaker for this very conference in Lanesboro. So if you were there, you may recognize Nori. I'm going to hand it over to him because it's not about the partnership. It's really about the program that's been developed and how it can help you and your community. And I'll be available as will Nori afterwards if you have any questions. So Nori Winter.
Good morning. Abby's already acknowledged our partners, and hi guys over there. Good to see you again. Thanks so much for all of your hard work on this. this project. It's been a lot of fun. We've been working on it now for over a year. There are two products that I'm going to walk you through in varying degrees of detail. There is the online program, which is organized into 8 modules. They're PDF files that are downloadable, and they are available online. They're hosted at the City of Stillwater's city website, and the address will be the last slide of the presentation. So it's there live right now. You can download it this afternoon. And that is designed, as Abby alluded to, so that you can take a little bite, or you can have a chaw at the whole apple, depending on how much time you want to spend. And while the focus is on heritage preservation commissions, how many of us have said, gee, I wish my city council member better understood the system, or I wish property owners better understood how we operate. And or as commissioners, you said, gee, I wish that new guy on the commission better understood how we operate. So it really is designed for everyone who has some role in historic preservation to understand how a system works at a local government level and how it interfaces with state and federal programs. So it's a great primer in many respects for preservation at the local level. And it draws upon a lot of materials from communities here in Minnesota. As Abby noted, the web is a great source, and so, some of you I may have spoken with on the phone and gotten more specific ideas. There is a companion document, which is to be printable as a hard copy thing. It's 150 pages, and I'm going to read most of them to you today. Not. But I will give you an overview of that. What it does is it tracks the same organizational structure as the online system and goes into more detail into each of those topics. And so people that want to know more can go to that next level in the manual. And I will be showing a few examples along the way. So this is the cover of the manual. And for the presentation purposes, to distinguish the online show from the manual pages that I'll be showing you will be in vertical format, and online will be in horizontal format. Got that? Okay. The online course is organized essentially into 8 modules. There is a 9th one intended to end the course on an upbeat note, that we're all in this together and there's lots to achieve and you're doing a great job. But the meat of it is in the first 8 modules. There's one about why are we here? What is the heritage of the preservation movement, and why are local commissions a part of it? And how did we get started? Second one is on the legal foundations. We cribbed a lot from Mr. Mays in that respect. And even though you didn't get to hear his this morning about the legal aspects of preservation, that's where he is active at the National Trust and has been very helpful in terms of local commissions, translating a lot of the legal issues into something local commissions can use. A third module is about designating properties, how you identify them, and then what are the options for the way you designate them. And then the treatment of historic properties. And there's a technical set of terms that the National Park Service uses, but also some strategies about how do you think about an approach for a building that you want to make improvements to. Then there's one on the nuts and bolts for commissions, some basics about decision making and some of their roles. Another one on reviewing a project, the legal aspects of it, but also sort of the etiquette of design review and or reviewing a designation process. What are the dynamics for that? And then some special, the last 2 ones zeroed in on some of the issues that we heard in talking with representatives of just different commissions were some of the top of mind issues people deal with today. And so in legal issues, for example, economic hardship is one of them, and some of the frequent design issues, replacement windows, how many of us have had to struggle with that. So we zero in on a few of those in the later modules. So let me walk you through some of that. You're not going to be able to read this fine print at the back of the room, but you will see that those same chapters with more detail appear here for the table of contents for the online manual. And there is also a glossary, because what we did here was, even though we think a lot of these terms appear elsewhere in definition, people still want a place where some of the key terms related to operating as a Heritage Preservation Commission are located. So, Module 1, welcome. The role of preservation commissioners is that they are obviously serving local government, they're serving as volunteers, but they also have a responsibility because in many respects they are serving in a quasi-judicial role in several places. And that's a very important role that they play. And so this slide introduces that. And there's some just basic introductory material about the tutorial, which I've kind of explained to you already. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time dealing with that. Oh, and now you will note that we don't know what's going on here, but sometimes when you download the program, the fonts jump around. And the next time, if you close it and reopen it, they're fine. And there's something about the server right now that we're not quite clear what's going on there. If you literally copy it over, generally it's going to be okay, but you'll see here we've got a few of those glitches showing up here. That's not in the original document, so there's this, something that Adobe is doing for us that we don't want done. The acknowledgements are in there, the acknowledgements of our firm, and these are some of the other communities that we chatted with or drew materials from in developing the materials. So some of you are here, thank you very much. What we did find is there are a lot of great model materials in terms of ordinances, design guidelines, surveys, designation forms, application forms that are out there around the state. And several of those do appear in the appendices as examples. In many other cases, you will see that we have references and links in the document to many of those examples. And of course, acknowledgement for the partners grant that, that I alluded to. So the first chapter introduces some of the basic, and some mug shots here. I don't know if any of you were in the audience here from Redwood, but thank you very much. Along the way, we were able to get some examples of happy faces. That's the way commissioners always look during a meeting, of course. Now this is really odd, because on my machine, this is all fine. So I don't know maybe we should have been running it off of my machine. We'll see what happens here. So you're seeing odd bullets and things happening. There's just something in the translation we're not sure about. But we leave off the modules with a question. So in this case, let's say you've been invited to apply for a seat on the HPC. You're interested, but you're really not quite sure what that means, what's involved, what does it mean to be a commissioner, what's the legal basis for it, etc. So this chapter provides an overview of some of those ideas. And this is the same question, and again it'll be expanded in more detail in the manual. Well, why do we do this? We do it to, of course, honor our heritage, to support sound community development. We've all learned that there is a strong role in terms of livability, in terms of economic development that preservation plays. Tom told us a little bit about that earlier this morning. And to maintain a degree of livability, and then also sustainability, that we've all learned, of course, that reusing existing buildings is a very green thing to do. So that has led to that basic understanding, some fundamental goals that we see that most commissions and most communities have. And one is to maintain a connection with the American experience, to preserve resources that reflect our heritage, to prevent the loss or substantial alteration of significant properties, to preserve historic resources in the public interest and for future generations, and to establish federal assistance programs for preservation of historic resources. So these are some fundamental goals that commissions in the state operate with, and you will begin to see here references to other documents outside this that link to that. And so in this case, there's a reference to the statewide preservation plan, which itself has some more detailed goals that appear in the manual. So if you want to see how your local program connects with the broader goals for preservation at a statewide level. That information is available there. Now, the preservation movement has a wonderful heritage in America and in the state, of course. And it's important, I think, for people to understand that, because it's not something that has just been invented in the past few years. And that has happened at a variety of levels, from private to public and state and federal organizations. Some of the earliest ones cited are the Mount Vernon Ladies Association in 1853, saying something's got to be done. They can't tear this building down. And so many of them started at that kind of independent level. And the city of Stillwater here in the state was an early one in terms of moving forward with Rivertown restorations. Some of those are summarized in the manual in a little bit more detail, both for the public sector and the private sector, at the national level and the state level. And so, of course, at the national level, we have the National Park Service on the governmental side, and the National Trust and the private sector side. At the state level, the Minnesota State Historic Preservation Office, and then on the private sector side, the Minnesota Historical Society. And then at a local level, of course, there are many local heritage preservation commissions distinguished from historical societies or other nonprofit private preservation advocacy organizations that might exist around the state. At the state level, I mean, at the local level, nationally, our roots begin in Charleston. This was the first city that set up a local preservation commission as a governmental body. And this was long before the 1966 National Preservation Act set up the national programs that we draw upon so much. And so it's really important to understand that this has been a local and a grassroots movement for some time, and that's an important thing for local commissions to be able to convey to their communities. This is not a top-down movement. This is something that started with people saving individual buildings and looking around their communities and looking at districts that needed to be saved. So that heritage, that history, and God knows what Faribault did in 1985, but I'm sure it was wonderful. I'm sorry we didn't think to check these slides when we loaded them onto this computer, and it could be the different versions of Acrobat or something or other, just not quite translating. Well, so we understand a little bit about the role of commissions, about the heritage of where we came from. What are some of the basic roles of commissions? Stewardship, helping to promote good use of historic buildings in a respectful way is important, but also identification, that is helping to monitor and sponsor surveys that identify historic resources, evaluating those, going through designation processes, that is to list them as individual landmarks or as historic districts. Participating in preservation planning and participating in partnerships are some key roles. This is aside from the responsibilities that are often discussed, which are those of design review and holding formal hearings, etc. So those are again explained in more detail in the manual. Then there's a discussion of some of the benefits, and we touched on those a little bit earlier in terms of the economics. There are, of course, numerous studies, statewide studies and local studies from across the country that document the economic benefits, particularly of local historic district designation and the protection that it brings and the investment that it attracts into those areas in terms of stabilizing or enhancing property values, but also its role in heritage tourism and promoting economic vitality in general. We are learning more and more about the environmental benefits, certainly, and there are references and links to some of those studies in the course as well. Reusing buildings means those materials don't go to the landfill, and we're not having to generate more energy to produce the materials to replace that building, as well as many of our historic buildings are, in fact, efficient when operated appropriately in terms of energy conservation and even generation sometimes. So there is an environmental benefit and sort of that of livability. So again, you will begin to see here some of the information related to some of those benefits, such as the link here for information related to preservation incentives. And a couple of other examples from the manual that illustrate some of the incentive programs, both at the federal and the state levels. And along the way, you will see that there are actually some examples of hard copies of some of the forms that are used in those incentive programs. In addition to the state and federal incentive programs, there are some at the local levels that we discovered in our research, and several of these are discussed again in more detail in the manual. But low-interest loan programs, some commercial rehabilitation loans, some grants, some technical assistance in terms of architectural assessments, and facade renovation programs. So these are equally important, even if they're modest in the amount of dollars spent. It is a symbol that these communities are committed to promoting preservation locally. And so again, in the manual, you will see a more detailed discussion and explanation of some of those programs, such as these from Little Falls and Mankato that are being discussed here, which includes a low interest or zero interest rehabilitation loan program and a variety of other tools. So that's the first module, sort of why are we here, some of the benefits of it, some of the basic incentives that exist. Now, do we have a right to do this? Do we have a right to regulate property locally? And how do we officially designate something as being historically significant? How do we apply those? And what's the difference between being on the National Register and the local register? How many of us have dealt with that question and wished we'd had something that we could have easily given someone as an answer? Well, we quoted one of the famous legal counsels in the movement here, but with a question of, do we have the legal right to do this? And Tom Mays, legal counsel from the National Trust for Historic Preservation, tells us fundamentally communities do have the right to protect historic properties. However, they must do so within the parameters of laws that affect regulation of property and that must employ accepted operating procedures. In a nutshell, that's the answer that you can give that council member or that property owner. But the document goes on to fill in a little bit more of the details, and again provides links to a lot of the helpful information that really gets into much more detail about the legal aspects of designating and regulating properties at the local level. But fundamentally, the starting point is to have an ordinance that has some key elements. And this is a checklist that highlights some of those that a good ordinance should have. And that is a clear statement of its purpose and the establishment of the commission, what their powers and duties are, what the criteria are for designating historic properties, and the procedures for designating, the hearing process, the notification requirements, etc. What they can review and what actions they can take on those reviews. Do they have the power to issue a certificate of appropriateness? Is that a requirement for doing work on a historic property? And if so, what are the standards that they will use? And while we may have design guidelines, they are linked to the standards that are embedded in the ordinance. And there will be a provision for economic hardship if the ordinance also can prohibit demolition of historic resources. There may be interim protection provisions for properties that are in the process of being considered for designation. That's often a very sensitive period because otherwise alterations or loss may occur. There may be a section on the demolition by neglect, that is a minimum maintenance requirement so that a building is not allowed to just simply decay and lose its historic features, because the city's health and safety code generally doesn't kick in early enough to prevent loss of key features of a historic resource. And so that minimum maintenance clause is often very important in an ordinance. And then, of course, what happens if we don't follow the law? what are the enforcement provisions and the penalties allowed, and then what are the appeals processes, which almost always be there. So those are fundamental elements of a checklist. Well, it's just getting worse. There then will be some rules of procedure, which may be a part of the ordinance or may be adopted as a separate document. But that includes meeting schedules. When do they happen? What's the minimum requirement for attendance at the meetings? What are some of the requirements for filing an application? When, how far in advance? What are the documents that are required? And then what is the requirement for public notification of the meeting and of the agenda that is going to be at that meeting? And then what is the process for public comment? These are all key parts of rules of procedure that a preservation commission should have. So, how am I doing? Okay? Huh? Not doing great. Okay. All right. Is this of interest? Are you seeing, is this looking like something you can use, you guys? Okay, great. Science, you're just smiling. So yes. Okay. All right. Life is good. So let's look at a couple of those in detail that the rules of procedure should include. These are again from the online program. During the hearing, there should be an opportunity for the commission to hear staff comments, to receive the applicant's presentation, and most often this is the sequence they occur in. Some commissions have the applicant present before the staff provides their report, but many do it in this order. To then receive comments from the public. And this is before the commission has started grilling the applicant in any way. This is to be certain that all of the information is in the room before discussion begins on the appropriateness of the application. And then there are questions by the commission. This is all during the public hearing process. At this point, questions from the commission will relate to clarification of the evidence being submitted. Is that drawing showing brick on that wall that you're proposing? Is a question that a commissioner might ask during the hearing process. Then there is the decision-making stage of the meeting, where the hearing is closed in terms of hearing from the public, and now the commission begins its deliberation. And of course, part of this is be certain that there are enough in the room to make that decision. There should be rules for how that meeting progresses and how discussion occurs, and then rules for making a motion and for taking a vote and what constitutes a formal decision. So those are all part of the decision-making process that should be written up in the rules of procedure. Now, we have our meeting, and we have a property before us. How did that property get there as a designated resource? Well, that begins with a survey. And the survey will include a field inspection phase of a variety of sorts, and from which a description may be derived, a description of the condition. That description will include some physical information about the aspects of the building, but also any cultural, historical associations with it as well. And it will include photographs and drawings and other maps. That is a part of what the survey document will provide. And generally there are forms, of course, filled out for individual properties in that way. That results in an inventory, which is a summary of the findings from that survey, in which each of the properties is looked at to determine is it historically significant or not, if you're dealing with a district, potential district survey, for example. And so it will be organized by individual properties. There will typically be individual forms for them, and the unreadable two lists are that they're grouped into those that are considered historically significant or contributing, and those that are non-contributing, of course. A good survey now identifies all properties within the survey area. It does not just highlight those that are known or quickly understood to be historically significant. Because at a local regulatory level, it's extremely important to know if I'm going to be making an alteration to a property, am I going to be held to the standards for the treatment of an historic resource, or not, because non-contributing resources are handled, generally speaking, as though you were reviewing an application for new construction in the historic district. The considerations there are, is the work going to be compatible with the district at large? Because you're not concerned with preservation of the windows in the non-contributing structure. Whereas, if it were a contributing structure, then the preservation of the windows would be, of course, a key factor. So the survey needs to upfront tell us which of those tracks of review, if you will, a property will be falling through in terms of the regulatory process. So the inventory is very, very important. And again, the state the hands-on manual goes into a little bit more detail. And for those of you who want to know, presently at the state level, of course, because of all the surveys that the SHPO sponsors, that's all held at the state level. There are more than 70,000 historic structures and approximately 18,000 archaeological sites that are currently in that state inventory. Yes, sir?
Yeah, one thing I find myself wondering is is there a single template for the local property laws in all of our communities, or do they vary from community to community?
The question is there a template for the laws?
Because clearly that affects how we use this material.
There are some model ordinances out there, and we have cited, rather than a statewide model ordinance, we have cited some in the manual that are local ordinances that have some good models. They share many components, but a model one will have that checklist of those components that I mentioned earlier in terms of what is a good ordinance. There are also then models for survey forms and for designation forms, and there are models for design guidelines. And I'll be showing you a few more of those as we move through this. But there isn't a fill-in-the-blank set of tools that is available. And that's partially the nature of the movement. It is still continuing to evolve and be modified over time. So while you can go online and find some models from a variety of states, I think some of the local complete ordinances that we cite might be better places to start for that. So how am I doing so far? Is this interesting? Good. Well, in that survey process, one of the underlying considerations is certainly historic significance. Is the property associated with historical events, or is it associated with distinctive design, or other movements, or with people of particular note in the community? But aside from that, the building has to convey enough of the materials and features from that period of significance in order to be considered a historic resource. And in that sense, its integrity as a property is evaluated. And so to help commissioners understand that, and property owners, there's a diagram in the training manual that sort of illustrates the ideal perfect state of a property that remains in its original condition. But also there are many that have been modified but still retain a sufficient amount of their historic fabric and character-defining features that we would still say it is a contributor to the historic district. But there are others that are beyond the pale. They've been so substantially altered that there isn't enough of the original building fabric remaining to say that this building retains its integrity, and it would be classified as a non-contributor. So this is perhaps an oversimplified diagram, but it's at least to help people understand that there is a point at which you pass over from being a contributor to a non-contributor, and that's the role of a professional surveyor and of the commission in evaluating those surveys to confirm that determination. This diagram illustrates those steps in a survey and identification and then designation of properties as it typically operates. The survey itself is conducted. That is then summarized in that inventory of findings of which property is the area eligible for a district, which properties are contributing, etc. And then there's a decision of, well, okay, now we've determined it is eligible, but are we going to do anything with it? We may just simply leave it on our inventory, recognizing that, but there may not be the political will to designate it, or we may not for other reasons, it may not be on our priority list at the moment. But at a certain point, that resource, that district may, or individual property may then be nominated. And in Minnesota, there basically are two options for nomination, for designation officially as an historic resource. One is, of course, the National Register of Historic Places, and the other is the local designation. And, of course, you will understand that the National Register provides protections from federal actions and provides incentives for private stewardship of historic resources. But it does not in and of itself regulate individual properties owned privately. That happens at the local level under the local ordinance and the local designation. So the two, while they are often related and may actually have the same boundaries, the rules and the tools that they use are different. And that's an important distinction for commissions and the public and elected officials to understand. And that is why in many cases an early step may be a National Register designation, because it does recognize an area as being historically significant. But local designation may follow later. And the boundaries may be different, and we'll touch on that in a minute. So what would be the effects of that National Register listing? That's, as I said, it's honorary. It identifies those properties as being historically significant. It does provide some measure of protection from federal and some state activities as well. And some of you may obviously be very familiar with the Section 106 review processes, which is one of the key tools that being on the National Register provides. But it doesn't place those restrictions on private property owners. It does make properties potentially eligible for donation of preservation easements, which could be a benefit to some property owners. But it can be, unfortunately, it can be demolished. That is not a regulation at the federal level. So we've talked about how we're going to have a survey that identifies resources. Well, what is that formal designation process? And so here's Northfield's designation form, a part of it. But so the nomination is prepared. That's a document that describes the historic significance of the area, accumulates the findings in terms of the individual surveys, and justifies why the property or the district may be designated. That is filed with the HPC. A formal hearing is scheduled. The commission acts. It refers it often to the planning commission, and which then refers it to city council or to the county commissioners for actual action. Since this is basically a zoning action, it's a land use regulation, it generally will be required that it goes before the city council or the board of county commissioners to make the final and formal designation. And then there is an appeal process. So those are the steps in designation, and they're again explained in more detail in the manual. Another important part of that survey, ideally, is the identification of what we would call key character-defining features. That can happen in the design review process, but it's best if it's already been documented in the survey form. Those are those elements that are essential to conveying the historic significance of the property. And for a traditional Main Street building, these are some examples of some of those elements that would be identified as being key character-defining features. Why is that important? Because in the design review process, if I'm proposing alterations, the question the commission is going to ask is, how will that affect those key character-defining features? And so the extent to which that can be documented makes it clear for property owners from the outset how to approach a project, makes it easier for the commissioners to focus in on those aspects of the proposal that are critical to maintaining the integrity of the property, and it helps everyone see that that this is an informed process that is based on fact, that it's not subjective, it's not personal opinion, it's the commissioner's interpretation of how this proposal affects the key character defining features of that resource. So it's very important to have those kinds of things stated to the extent possible. And not only is it key character defining features of individual properties, but of how those properties relate to each other if we're considering a district. So in a traditional commercial downtown, for example, the fact that there are very transparent first floor storefronts that tend to align along the street and that are highlighted with moldings and cornices, and perhaps on a second floor that there are other moldings and cornices that also generally align, not necessarily lockjaw rigid, but enough that there is a sense of continuity along the street. That is a key character defining feature of the district, such that if I were to consider alterations to an existing building, or certainly any new construction, the relationship to those key features would be an important consideration. So the extent to which this is documented in the designation helps everyone understand what the ground rules are going to be. That then is mapped, and what's important about a local designation, now many surveys of course use National Register criteria, and the National Register focuses on basically the lasso approach, which is we want to put a rope around the concentration of properties that are contributors. And once we hit the edges where there's a low concentration of contributors, we leave them out. And that's fine from a National Register standpoint, but sometimes at the local level, it's the properties that are just outside the district. The green line here is the district. It could be that what goes on in that block may very much affect the character of this historic district if we get a very, very out of context new building there. So sometimes a local district boundary picks up a little bit more land or picks up some blocks of non-contributing land that are embedded within an area for the very reason that in terms of considering context, we want to have a say about what happens there. So that may be one of the reasons why you will see boundaries of local districts varying from those of the National Register. This is a designation map that I particularly like, and it's actually from Mackinac Island in Michigan. So while it's not a Minnesota example, it's one of the best ones I've seen that in a very, very simple graphic way shows the contributing properties here are in the red color, the non-contributing properties are in the tan color. But what's also neat is that it also identifies some other resources. There is a breakwater here, and there are some other archaeological sites and engineering features that are identified within the district as well, including some of the docks. So it is a great map that quickly shows what's going on in terms of the district. The fourth module gets into the basic treatments of historic properties. And I've sort of touched on a little bit of how you determine what's important to preserve in terms of identifying some of those key features. So let's say at this stage of the game, you are a commissioner and you know that you're getting ready for a hearing and there is a proposal to alter a historic commercial building. How do you get ready for the meeting, and how do you determine if the work is going to be appropriate or not? Before the proposal, it's important to identify key features that contribute to the significance of the resource. And so that may already have been in the nomination form, or in a staff report, or in an orderly way in that initial fact-finding part of a meeting. You could discuss and identify what the key features are going to be of the property. And of course, that's going to depend on what kind of property it is within the district. Now, in many of our traditional residential and commercial districts where we have a lot of contributors that are not necessarily individual landmarks, a lot of those key character defining features tend to be located on the front and perhaps on the sides that are most immediately visible from the street frontage. And and that's what this diagram is illustrating here on a commercial building, that certainly this is going to have a lot of key features. Perhaps as we move back, these are going to be very important. As we move farther back into the rear, they may be less critical for many of our contributing properties. That may cue up how you would apply your guidelines, your criteria for alterations. Certainly here, preserving the facade intact is going to be a high priority. Perhaps accommodating an addition or an alteration of openings, etc. on the rear may be possible without substantially reducing the integrity of the property. Now, this is not a solid rule by any means, and there are certainly properties where that's not going to be the case. Institutional facilities such as churches, courthouses, city halls, etc. are designed often to be in the round, and the backside may have some very critical key character defining features. So it's not an absolute rule, but it's guidance in terms of considering where those key character defining features are. There's some basic principles that are set forth, and they're drawn upon from the Secretary's standards to some extent, but interpreted in a way that may make it easier for lay people to understand. And a basic principle is to preserve those key features, to retain the integrity of the resource, to respect its historic character, not change its style, and to seek uses that are compatible with the historic character. And while local commissions don't often regulate use, thinking about how a proposed use may be stretching the ability to be accommodated in a historic resource is something that they can certainly comment on. There are then the alternative treatment strategies that the Secretary of the Interior sets forth, and of course those are preservation, restoration, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. And they have very technical definitions that the Park Service uses, and those are provided in the manual. Rehabilitation is the one that most commissions use because it's generally the one that's more flexible to some extent in terms of considering compatible alterations to a property. Even though individual pieces of a building might be preserved, others might be restored, others might be reconstructed, the general approach is typically rehabilitation. And that's mostly what commissions focus on. Then, in terms of applying those treatments though, how do you put that together into an overall strategy for the treatment of an historic property? Because it's not just an evaluation of physically what the building needs. There's also functionally what the owner needs that has to be considered in the project. So there's a suggestion on the steps that an owner should go through in terms of coming up with their approach to their property. First, understand why is the building significant and what are its key features. And then what is it you need to do? I need to add some more space. I'm thinking about building an addition to the building, a rooftop addition to my commercial structure. So that then leads to a treatment strategy that is a combination perhaps of those 4 treatments that the Secretary of the Interior gives us, matching up with my programmatic needs. So this is to help property owners think through in a rational way how to set up an approach for a building. And it's to help commissioners in terms of asking the questions. How does this proposed work fit into a broader strategy for the property? There are then case studies provided that illustrate how some of those treatments come together. Thank you, Mankato, for this one. Of a nice before and after, illustrating some of those principles embedded in those 4 treatments for historic properties. Quickly, I'll just touch on a couple more of the other chapters and then probably stop and take some questions. The section on nuts and bolts for commissioners points out their basic roles. I touched on some of the broader sort of outreach roles earlier on. These are some of the fundamental ones that on a daily hearing basis or monthly meeting basis that they're going to be engaged in. One is decision making, whether it's for a certificate of appropriateness or to recommend designation of a historic resource. They may participate in National Register nominations, particularly as certified local governments, in terms of recommendations to the State Historic Preservation Officer. They may also participate in administering incentives, such as the local assistance programs that we cited earlier on, and in educational programs. And these are important ones, even though the regulatory side is what we often think of in terms of being a commissioner. The educational aspect is an ongoing responsibility as well. There's also a discussion of the roles of staff, of elected officials, and of other players in the preservation world with respect to how they interface with preservation commissions. And it's important to think about staff, because in some cases they do provide technical assistance to property owners, especially if they're trained professionally and have some background in preservation. Some commissions only have administrators, a secretary who can handle meeting notices and minutes, but doesn't actually have the time or perhaps the training to actually engage in making recommendations. In some communities, and particularly some of the larger cities, they actually have the ability to make some decisions on their own, some delegated authority. And that is, we're seeing more and more of across the country as commissions seek to streamline the process and minimize the amount of agenda items on a public hearing.
Question. When you're presenting, when this is being presented, say, to our HPC or in our community, how do you see the process of adapting the contents so that it talks about us? We don't use COAs, we use the building permit process, for example. Do we just sort of wing it when we get to those slides? Is that the best thing?
The question is, if some of these slides don't quite match up the way your program works, how do you tailor it? In many cases, the manual will provide some of those exceptions and those other conditions that you can talk to. So the point was that some commissions, the permit process is linked to the building permit and not to the certificate of appropriateness. And so I believe some of those distinctions do show up in the manual. That one is an interesting particular question, because typically a building permit isn't required for some exterior work in many communities, and alterations can occur that could be damaging to the integrity of the historic resource that are under the radar of the building permit. And so that's why most commissions do have a certificate of appropriateness requirement that is a little bit broader, that affects any changes to the exterior skin of a building, some of which may not be subject to the trigger of a building permit application.
So how do you see us making the adaptation to the presentation? What should we do?
Well, again, I think in some cases you will see that level of detail is provided in the manual, so that you would be able to say, here, there's an exception to this.
Do we skip over the slide now?
No, I think you would simply say, we don't use the C of A, we instead use the building permit. I mean, I think that would be pretty straightforward. You certainly can skip over slides if you wish, but I think in most cases it would be easy enough to say, just as a side note, this is not how we do it.
Has this been used yet?
I'm sorry?
Has this been used yet?
No, this is the premiere.
Oh, okay.
This is the premiere.
Sorry.
So then let's talk just a little bit about design guidelines. We'll finish up this module and then open it up for other questions. They help to implement and interpret the criteria for making determinations of appropriateness that are set forth in the ordinance. And ideally, they are objective criteria that they will use and commissions will use in making those determinations. Good guidelines are well illustrated. They have graphics to them. They are organized in a hierarchical structure where there may be some background information, some specific instructions, and then some supplementary information. And you may not be able to read this, but this one particularly says the guideline is preserve significant stylistic and architectural features, and then there's an explanation of what some of those are. So these are all elements that a good guideline an effective one typically will include, even down to whether or not the illustration is of something that's appropriate or inappropriate. Are they enforceable? This is where we had to lapse into you betcha. Sorry, we just had, at this point in the process of the project, we were looking for something humorous, so.
I didn't think you were going to.
Yeah, we did.
Cheers.
We did. Sometimes people call them standards just to make it clear that they're enforceable. Some people just intuitively think guideline means it's not enforceable. But if the ordinance says that the commission shall use the guidelines in determining compliance with the criteria that are in the ordinance, they're enforceable. But we just want to make that clear. One of the questions that commissions do ask, though, is, well, we can't afford or we don't have our locally tailored guidelines with those spiffy illustrations. What do we do? Fortunately, we do have the Secretary of the Interior standards, which are the very reliable, and many commissions do reference them in their ordinance, regardless of whether or not they have local design guidelines as well. What makes that decision defensible? One is, as I mentioned, that it's based on the ordinance, that they have followed the rules of procedure that we've alluded to earlier in terms of how a meeting is conducted and how decisions are made, that they have used that documentation from the survey in terms of evaluating how that property is going to be affected and which sets of guidelines are going to apply, whether it's for the historic buildings or new ones, and that they have referenced those guidelines in their decision making. And so those are key points in the commission reviewing those kinds of actions. There's guidance on the content of what the motion should include. And those of you who have staff, they're generally going to have drafted this for you ahead of time, but this is a good checklist in terms of what should be in that ordinance. So I think we're going to stop at this point. I think this gives you the meat of the bulk of them. There are some of the later chapters that get into a little bit more of the details I mentioned about windows and sustainability and some of the grittier legal aspects in terms of economic hardship and demolition by neglect. But this gives you an overview of the bulk of the sort of the working tools that a commission uses, the way in which they operate, the rational system within which local commissions perform their functions. The fundamental theme of all of this is that it's not overly complicated. It is doable. Lay people serving as commissioners can certainly perform these roles, but there is an orderly, reasoned structure to the way in which preservation happens at the local level, and it's important that we all follow it and recognize it and convey that out to the public at large. So it is an online resource. Oh, let me just, we will go to that side, I promise that. We'll skip over these things. These are all previews of what you will see. There we go. So here is the Stillwater website and the link. And that will get you to the manual and to the preservation. I will. I'll back up. I just want to show that it will then lead you to it. What I did want to point out is that the online form is a low resolution format because obviously of the file size, but the city can provide you with a high resolution format if necessary, and all you need to do is contact Abby and you can get that. But so there's the link.
Nora, for questions, maybe I can steal that microphone.
Sure.
And I think the other
Yeah,
ones
sure.
are on those ones. So, if anybody has questions.
Thank you. I was interested in the survey portion. You know, on the website, it says you can do an intensive reconnaissance survey. So if you do a reconnaissance survey, you can't really go forward with national registration for a district, I think, or for a district or a location without doing the other survey. So can you kind of clarify that, which surveys we should be doing, what makes sense, and how do we get to nomination?
Those are,
Well, I just, no, I think, that could work, but you want me to answer that one? That's really, what is the state's policy about intensive versus?
Well, I think it depends on your goals, first of all. I mean, if you need to do a comprehensive citywide survey, reconnaissance is a good logical first step. If you don't have all of the resources within, in this case, the city of Ely that have been surveyed. And then you could move from that into a next phase, intensive level survey.
On smaller portions?
Yes,
Yeah, I don't.
maybe not.
Am I on?
no, I thought it was earlier, but, oh, one of these people. Hello, hello? All right, at a local level, obviously, the intensive level is preferred because it does have that property by property evaluation and is going to make the administration of a district much easier for the commission and for property owners as well. So they are on. I don't know, maybe they just take a while to respond. See, now we're. Go back where I was, it's the same. Everything was fine until.
All right, I'm just, yeah. Now, can you hear me? Yeah, no, you can't hear me. All right.
Try the portal.
Put it back in the stand and see.
You don't get the feedback.
Okay. Well, there are certainly many districts that were designated with what is effectively a reconnaissance survey. A boundary was drawn around a few representative properties of historic significance. And we have inherited many of those kinds of districts around the country. And so it's important to recognize when you do have those that are that were done at a reconnaissance level. And I mean, if you're limited to resources and you really need to move forward with designation, I suppose you could do so with a reconnaissance survey that is enough to justify a boundary. But recognize then that each time a property comes in for review, there's going to have to be that determination of, is this a contributor or not?
Is it telling me that it's time to stop?
No.
Turn on one of these. Is this on now? Is it on?
Yeah.
Is it on? Okay, now it's on. All right. Okay. Any more questions? Yes, sir. And what?
Can we purchase that 150-page manual?
You can download it and print it out. So that is, it's free. You don't have to purchase it, but you will have to print it out. I don't think the city's equipped to run hard copies for you. Sorry. But it is on this site, yes. You see both the online and the manual there are links to the two different documents. So you can print out the entire manual. There was a, yes, ma'am. Yes.
I just wondered if you could talk about the relationship between staff and HPC and the importance of partnership.
Yes, and that I think is discussed a little bit more in the manual of understanding that it is a partnership between staff and the HPC. Some HPCs think that staff should do all of the work and don't recognize that they are almost always stretched beyond their capacity and their workload assignments. Many staff are really only assigned a percentage of their time to staffing a preservation commission, so it's important to be realistic about their role. that they also do serve, when they have professional training, as advisors to the commission in terms of framing motions and making recommendations that should be acknowledged along the way. And accepting where they have delegated responsibility to accept those decisions that staff have made. What we often say is that you don't review the review, but you review the reviewer. What does that mean? If I have delegated to staff the responsibility for minor alterations, and they have the authority to make that decision, if I hear about a decision that I disagree with, I don't call that into question. In some regular period of review, you review how the staff are performing, and you can have a discussion about, we think perhaps you're not interpreting the standards the way we see them being interpreted, but it's not that you're reviewing or rehearing a case that you've already delegated to staff. And so that's an important distinction in terms of respecting their responsibilities. Does that answer your question a little bit? Okay. Yes, sir, Stanley.
I was just wondering, in Duluth, I'm looking at the HPC as president there that nominating multi-property, so a multi-property nomination. The three types of properties that we're looking at is the fire stations and the early water cisterns and pump houses, 1905, as part of a epidemic that raged through Duluth at that time. And then the brownstone multifamily dwellings within our neighborhoods in Duluth, which are sort of definitive of those neighborhoods. And I haven't been able to, and I've asked Mr. Coop there, to come up with a multi-property listing form at the local level. Of course, there's the national level form. I was wondering if any other commissions, or if you know, multi-property forms for nominations.
Boy, that's a great question. And no, I have not come across a local form for a thematic designation like that. So once you create it, share it with us.
And that's what I might be doing, is we might be creating one for our city. So.
Okay, all right, one more question, yes.
Well, that was actually my question. Can you have a thematic designation instead of a district that you actually designate? So does that go benefit the whole community? Anything that would meet those criteria would automatically be under review without being locally designated? Without an individual property. So my understanding is, and sorry, you can have local designation, or you can actually designate a district. No other properties are going to come, or the National Register, no other properties will come under the HPC's review. Is that the case in most communities?
If I'm understanding the question, I mean, the purview of the commission is generally properties that are formally designated in some manner, whether that's as individual resources or as contributors in a historic district. A thematic or a multiple property listing lists a collection of properties, but they are specifically identified. It's not just generically saying fire stations are designated. It's fire station A, B, and C that have been officially identified, because D actually isn't an historic resource. It is a fire station. So it's not just a blanket. But what it does do is it kind of streamlines what otherwise would have been a series of individual nominations that are linked by the theme and history of being fire stations and the early movement of protecting the city, or whatever the historic context might be for it. Okay, well, let me ask you a question. Does this look like these will be helpful tools?
That's really great.
Okay, great. Well, I'm glad to hear that. I hope you don't experience these bugs. We will continue to monitor, and if there is some sort of a problem with the way the PDFing occurred, we'll get that cleaned up. And she's doing it, and it's fine. So it may be just simply that some of the fonts being used, this particular computer didn't have those in its PDF file. So hopefully, if you see it silver, just move it to a different computer and it should work. Thanks very much.